everybody. This is Tina, of course, as Sherry said, and Adam and I will be presenting today on this topic, and we're excited to be with you. There are a lot of people online today, and so we're going to do some polling questions during our hour here, and try to give you just the best 1 hour experience that hopefully will meet your needs and expectations. So I am a speech pathologist by training and worked clinically prior to coming into publishing and my work here at Pearson. And Adam, why don't you introduce yourself and your background a little bit as well?
Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Scheller. I am a school psychologist by training, and I work in public and non-public private special education settings prior to coming to Pearson.
Great. Thanks, Adam. So while we jump in here, right before we get started, I know many of you are concerned about this, so let me jump to this right away. We are offering APA, NASP, and ASHA CEUs for this training session, and so in your handout that's attached to your final reminder email, as well as here on the screen, we have instructions for submitting your evaluation forms and such for those respective organizations to be able to provide CEUs for you. So keep in mind here we need to have the form sent to Darlene Davis. The email address is on the screen there as an attachment. You have until next Wednesday, Valentine's Day, the 14th, and I'll get to ASHA requirements here in a second on the next slide. But this is for APA and NASP CEUs, and then for the ASHA-based folks that are on the line, you know the drill. This is ASHA CEU participant form and the evaluation form. They are in the reminder email that you received, and you can get them from us, or you can go to speechandlanguage.com and download them there as well. And of course, those forms need to be mailed, hard copy, to Darlene Davis at the ASHA, at the address here at Pearson in San Antonio. And they have to be postmarked no later than, again, next Wednesday, the 14th. So before your Valentine's Day celebrations, make sure you are downloading those forms, filling them out appropriately as required by your respective professional organization, and getting those to us. Finally, if you are interested in obtaining an attendance certificate, for any of this, of course, you need to attend the entire live presentation today. You do not need to submit any additional paperwork for an attendance certificate. You'll receive one if you stay the whole time from us. So not to worry. Just give us a little extra time because there's a lot of you on and a lot of processing going on. So give us about 10 business days to get your certificate to us, and we will deliver that to you because you were here. Okay, I hope that's clear. I know Sherry is monitoring the chat box in case you have follow-up questions about that, but we've got you covered on the CEU front and the attendance certificate front. Okay. Disclosures required by our professional organizations as well. Adam and I both work for Pearson Clinical Assessment. On the non-financial side, I just wanted to be clear about some of my other roles and responsibilities in my non-financial volunteer life. So those are our disclosures. Our learning outcomes, as you see here, 2 areas of dyslexia training that practitioners request most often: knowledge gaps we're going to talk about today, and roles and responsibilities. Certainly there's a focus here on interprofessional practice. As an SLP, I know ASHA is very much engaged in this. I know that in the NASP and APA worlds and in other professional organizational worlds, there's of course a lot of talk about this as well. I do want to say, as we jump into the agenda here and look ahead to the hour in front of us, we're not quite an hour anymore, Adam and I put this data set together in preparation for the ASHA convention last fall in November, and we did present this initial set of data there. This is also very much expanding and talking about psychologists and the school psych role, as well as the teacher and other professionals in the educational setting roles. One of the reasons that we focused here in some cases on SLPs as well as a compare and contrast with other professionals is I think as you look at the world of dyslexia, there's little question about whether or not the school psychologist should have a role in this area in particular. There's little discussion about whether or not the reading specialist should be involved, and also very little discussion that the classroom teacher is involved in this process because of their direct access to the student on a daily basis. But one of the things that, at least as an SLP especially, I observe is that The role of the SLP in a dyslexia process gets a lot of questions from psychologists and from teachers. What's the SLP's role in that? But also because it's probably the most heterogeneous role that's out there today. SLPs are involved, but not universally, and I think we're finding our way as a profession as well. So given all of that context, one of the frames that Adam and I looked at as we reviewed this, certainly for our ASHA talk last fall, but also today, is we're looking at what's happening with that SLP role and how does that relate to the other professions. So lots of interesting conversations around that to be had, and certainly the data set that we're about to share with you will illustrate that. Okay, so our first polling question of the day, we'd like to know of the over 1,000 people that are on this webinar at the moment, what is your professional role? So go ahead and answer that question, and then I'll display the results in about 10 or 15 seconds. I see some of you entering your answer into the chat box, which is fine. I believe you can also go ahead and directly click on the screen so you can answer by radio button. So feel free to do that as well. Just a couple more seconds. We have about 830 of you that have commented already in the poll itself. I'm going to go over and skip to the results here just to show who we've got on the line today. Predominantly SLPs and school psychologists on the phone, but certainly other groups represented as well, some reading specialists, some administrators, some general or special educators as well, and then some people who would classify themselves as other. So you could be parents, you could be advocacy leaders, any number of other folks we've had join us in the past. So thanks for that. We've got a good diverse group today as we hoped. Let me just do a quick bit of introduction as we talk about professional roles and knowledge and skill gaps as it relates to dyslexia in this overall interdisciplinary practice that we do as we address dyslexia in our school settings. If you think about, you're on this call, so you're biased toward the discussion of dyslexia just by being here today. But certainly as you step back and you look at the landscape of education, I've said this a number of times before, but I so firmly believe that this is sort of the new autism. So if you remember a decade or so ago, there was this huge groundswell of work and conversation and advocacy around autism and the services that were provided and how we supported students in education who would be on the spectrum somewhere related to autism. And now here we are in dyslexia. And if you look at what's happening, 2017, certainly 2018 as it unfolds here as well, there's so many different things going on in this landscape. And just to ground us all in that same place, I just want us to pause for a minute and reflect on all of the action that's happening in dyslexia. Not just the advocacy groups, Decoding Dyslexia in particular. Every state in the union has a local chapter. There's a national Decoding Dyslexia group. Very much a groundswell of those groups like Decoding Dyslexia have been in the mainstream, squarely in this space, advocating for their students, their children in the area of dyslexia. State and federal legislation. We're now over 40 states in the country who have dyslexia legislation on the books in some way. Some of them, some of the legislation looks very much at definitions of dyslexia for state use. Some of them look at training and professional development requirements. Some of them look at other kinds of activity in terms of universal screening laws, et cetera. So there are a wide variety of legislative activities going on right now, but those are increasingly busy and then have impacts, of course, all over individual states. So just the knowledge of consumer activity, social media, of course, is here with us in at scale. And so as we think about all the talk that goes through social media, consumer, mainstream media, et cetera, just the knowledge and activity and the awareness of dyslexia has just grown exponentially over the last few years. The research landscape has always been and continues to be very diverse and very active in this space. The professional landscape, I think, is growing as evidenced by the 2,600 registrants we had for this particular webinar. This meeting in particular really looks at all of the webinars we've done over the last couple of years and the data that we've learned from that mass of interest. And then the commercial landscape, obviously, as a publisher, we're keen on that and watching what's happening. We're involved in that landscape, but certainly it's not just us. I mean, it's a noisy space commercially, and for all of us to deal with professionally, it's something to consider in the world. So with that, let's just ground ourselves in that busyness. So where are we going to fit professionally in that landscape? And so what we did was, over the last years, we took a look at all of the webinars that we've had like this, and we really wanted to look at who attended, why they attended, what the conversations were, and what we can learn from that. So Adam and I went through that process in detail, and I'm going to turn it over to him now and have him talk you through that data set, and then we'll have some observations and conclusions and some interaction with you about what we've learned.
Thanks, Tina. Hi, everybody. It's Adam again. So really, I just wanted to reiterate why this was so important to us. I mean, we stepped back and had a very different thought about how we should, or what types of things we should present regarding dyslexia. I mean, if you look at the list here, and these are webinars that we did from August of 2016 through September of 2017, and we've done a few others as well, but this is the data set that we analyzed. If you look at these we started out with looking at information. How do we provide information about dyslexia? How do we provide information about screening and assessment? We are an assessment company. We are experts in the field of assessment. So how do we couch this discussion in that framework? And we found, as you can see here, a very, as Tina even mentioned this earlier, a very large interest, a great interest in just the topic of dyslexia. Over 13,000 people reached, 7,000 people attending the live webinars. So essentially, if people were signed up, then they also got the recording link. So it's difficult for us to track exactly how many people watched. But if you look at this over time, starting back in August of 2016, we had a really big interest group starting early and kind of moving through. And essentially what we're going to do is just look at this data, try to help us understand why people attended these webinars, what was driving them to attend these webinars. Because we find that in the field of assessment and just understanding learning and professional development in general, we had to change our shift a little bit, or we had to shift our thinking a little bit and really address why folks were coming and what they wanted to learn. So what I just wanted to say was any of the webinars I had listed on the previous screen, just go ahead and answer this. Did you attend one or more, or did you attend one, or did you not attend any at all? Just trying to get a sense of the folks who are on the line here. Let me give that a quick minute. Okay, so it looks like we have a large majority of you not having attended any one of the previous webinars, but a good 14.5%, 15% attended one, and several of you, many of you actually, given the large number of people on the line, attended more than one. Okay, just giving you a good understanding of who we have on the line here. So essentially what we did was we looked at with such a huge trove of data, such a large database of information regarding who was attending. We looked at things like demographic data, where people were attending from, what their job titles were. We looked at the chat box information, similar to what's on the bottom left of the screen now. When people put unprompted questions in, the comments that they make, some interest in different areas that we were talking about. We also included many different polls, which were more or less direct questions from us that we asked of attendees during the webinar. And then also the feedback and evaluation sheets that folks submitted for either CEs, CE reimbursement, or for just general certificates of attendance. And we really looked at the comments and questions for after the webinars in terms of how people felt about the information and what they were looking for to go forward. So if we look at overall, and as Tina mentioned, the majority of this data is driven from speech language as a profession, but we made a lot of hypotheses, and we also made a lot of conclusions regarding other fields as well. So this will be appropriate and related to a lot of other practices as well. But over that, over 7,000 attendees, there were 1,127 that self-identified as speech language. It was consistent over time in terms of the attendance. About 10 to 20% of the webinar attendees were speech language, and that came in either second or third to psychologists or teachers and/or teachers. So that shifted back and forth. Psychologists and/or teachers tended to be number one every webinar, and then speech language pathologists came in second or third to that profession. In terms of when speech language pathologists attended, they tended to gravitate more towards the topical webinars. So, for example, the one that I discussed and I delivered on a hybrid model of dyslexia screening, that had the largest number of SLPs attend. And overwhelmingly, out of all of the webinars, we had mostly school-based professionals, but there were some private practitioners, university, and medical settings also represented. And I also see that on the line here today. I see several folks chiming in from private practice and other settings as well. I did have a question that came through that can previous webinars still be viewed? Absolutely. You can still go to our website, pearsonclinical.com, and I believe all of those can be found on the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen products page. If you scroll down, there's a training tab, and you can actually go back and watch all of those all of these webinars that we're referencing today. So let's look at the data for webinar number 1, which went all the way back to August of 2016. And that first one was I presented on a model for dyslexia screen, and essentially what we wanted to do was to prime the space and really talk about a broad view of dyslexia screening, and really to establish a foundational knowledge across an interprofessional audience. So even though we were looking at addressing speech language pathology, we did want to make this interprofessional as possible. For that, we had 62% psychologists, and 15% of the attendees were speech language pathologists. We had a total of 359 comments, and there were really 33 that stuck out to us in terms of this speech language needs and requests, and they tended to be very similar to the psychologist requests. They asked at that time for more in-depth content and discussion between the presenter and attendees, and more comparison of tools and tool choice. And really what that shows us is that there was a thirst for knowledge at that time. The hour that we had, the limited space that we had for discussion about dyslexia, folks wanted more of it. And they kept asking for more time to discuss specific questions and specific components or specific processes that they wanted further information about. With regard to quotes, the reason why we're including quotes in this is because they're so indicative of just the larger theme in general and themes in general. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think forward for the rest of the presentation today to really think about what are some themes that you see across all of these webinars. What are some themes that you think different professions may have from one another? Do speech and language pathologists have a different view or different requests than psychologists, than educators, than administrators? I'd like you to get a sense of that. So get a feel for that as we talk through and review these today. And then when Tina wraps up later on, she'll kind of bring us all together and have us really think about what we heard and what we assume can be our next steps for moving forward. So some of the quotes from the first webinar was, as an SLP, my work is increasingly involved with supporting reading. I love more in-services regarding phonological awareness because this is an area that's sorely under-addressed in many reading interventions. As an SLP and cognitive scientist, I really appreciate the emphasis on reading is language. That's an interesting one because, we know reading is language. Reading is written language. So a lot of the topics that I discuss and a lot of the processes that I talk about do incorporate that. So it's an interesting comment. And the last one, would have enjoyed seeing a little more examples of specific items in screeners as well as some practical examples. So again, looking at more examples, more thirst for knowledge. With regard to more quotes from the first webinar, it's a little more about what exactly an SLP's role in screening for dyslexia is. I know it is a collaboration, but would like to provide more examples. So really, this is when we started to think about what are the roles that we're seeing in schools. How do different professions operate? How do different schools operate? I worked in several different schools, and they operated very differently from one another. How was the interprofessional relationship? How did that teamwork work in one school versus another? They were very different. So we started to see this theme start to come out even from our first webinar. What are the roles and boundaries? What are the boundaries for reading intervention for speech and language versus special education or reading specialists? What is the difference between screening and diagnosing? So starting to see not only roles and responsibilities, but also some clinical questioning coming out as well. Our next two webinars were delivered by Dr. Sally Shaywitz, who, for those of you who don't know Dr. Shaywitz, she is a preeminent researcher in the field of dyslexia and has been doing so since the 1980s. She ran the Connecticut Longitudinal Study, which is where a lot of our information started to come out with regard to dyslexia, and she is a pioneer in the field. And she happened to agree to provide two webinars for us. The first one in September of 2016, and again, it was the first one. We did a single day. We did two separate sessions, and the goal was really for her to outline some of her work and research, and to give an overview of the foundational work of her screener. So, for those of you who don't know, she put together a behavioral screener. So it's a rating form that measures, basically rates a child on several different areas that are key indicators of dyslexia risk. So she talked a lot about that. And for that first webinar, we had 1,700 attendees. The largest number were teachers. Psychologists came in second at 32%, and speech language came in at a third at 10%. Really, the most common question came about was, again, more time for Q&A, more time for discussion. This was really, you start to see this across most of our comments and most of our interactions, which is, thanks, Adam, and I appreciate that when people, say thanks for the hour, but we want more. And I absolutely fully understand that and recognize that. For this hour, a lot of times we just don't have enough time to talk about all of the areas that folks are looking for. Really, again, this is just a quote from webinar number 2, which was the information was good, but I would like to have a little bit more time with the question and answer segment. When we moved to webinar number 3, which was the second webinar on that same day, we were really looking at a different audience, the same presentation as the morning, but we wanted to get more folks in and just have it separated into 2 different times. At this one, we had, again, a large number of teachers, 49%, psychologists at 25%, and speech language pathologists at 11%. And again, the most common request was more detail, hear more about examples from the screening test, how to interpret results. So really looking at more information there. Number 4 came from requests. So I came back after Dr. Shaywitz did her 2 sessions, and based on some feedback that we got about, hey, we'd like to see more information about a screener, we'd like to understand it in more detail. I came back and did a session in October of 2016 on that specific screening tool. So I went over the important points for screening, really how to differentiate screening from clinical assessment, from more diagnostic clinical assessment, what is important to consider when choosing screeners, those types of things, and then really looked in depth at the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. So I did that in October of 2016. And the SLP attendees at the time, so in terms of themes, we didn't have a lot of questions in terms of clinical, organizational, or assessment-specific questions. But it was interesting to see some of the comments coming through about that we compared from school psychologists to speech-language pathology and what types of questions and comments they had coming to them. Really, both speech-language and psychology started to talk about how information was helpful for their practice and could be applied in their setting. How important hearing how to appropriately choose a screener and what data that actually gives you. So really the differences between, for example, what is a universal screener versus what is a dyslexia-specific screener. Those types of comments really started to come out across the professions. So that continuity was pretty clear. The 5th webinar in February of 2017 was a dyslexia case study. So essentially what I wanted to do at this time was to think about looking at dyslexia symptoms, the causes and correlates and risk factors, and then think about looking at assessment from screening to progress monitoring. So it was really moving from that beginning stage, screening, assessment, intervention, monitoring process, to think about how to maybe change a process in your school system, or to adapt, or even just to think about the clinical questions that might come up from start to finish with regard to how you look at dyslexia and how you assess dyslexia. And we did have a large number of attendees there. Over half were psychologists, and almost a quarter were speech pathology. We started to get a lot more clinical questions here, really thinking about what exactly dyslexia is, what were the components of it, the hereditary components, thinking about the phonological processing indicators for future reading difficulties, thinking about what are the strengths in terms of visual strengths, can we differentiate between dyslexia and reading disorder. As you look at these comments and questions, we really start to see how the clinical questioning and understanding the disorder started to come out. And it's really interesting to me because at about the same time, and I'm interested to hear from those of you on the line here, what you felt was going on at the time in terms of the legislative landscape or the regulatory landscape in your region or your state. Because it was interesting to us that we started to see, as the legislative landscape and regulations in school districts started to change, some of the questions also started to change. So really thinking about going through and saying, what are some processes that we could put into place? What are some what are ways that we can address the mandate of our state or of our region? And then really moving into what are some of the key components and some of the areas that we should really start to think about and make sure we incorporate in our assessment process. We did also have some organizational workflow comments or questions, really not from speech pathology, but from other folks. And here's one from a pupil personnel professional. How important is it for a speech language pathologist as part of the screening team, to have them as part of the screening team looking to provide early intervention during summer prior to entering kindergarten? And really what that means is we were thinking about who we should be incorporating at the team level. And I think that's essentially what we're trying to get at with looking at this data. What is the level of data? What is the level of involvement across professionals that make up a best practice dyslexia assessment team at the school level? And if not, where do we fill in those gaps? And I think that's really leading us down the path of what is our main purpose for looking at this data in a different manner. Again, we did have some assessment-specific questions. So how to choose specific tests, how do we collect info that now that the district no longer uses AIMSA was a specific question. Some psychometrics questions, really looking at not wanting to know necessarily about the stats, but looking at treatment information. And there was an interesting difference between school psychology and speech language pathology questions and comments. And the first one really is that speech language pathology tended to focus more on interventions. So at the end of our assessment process, what are we looking at in terms of interventions? And school psychologists and psychologists in general tended to think about tools for assessment and eligibility questions, laws and regulations, looking at more on cognition, how is that related to dyslexia. So it was a very different dichotomy that we saw here with this data and the differences between professions. In our last webinar, the last data that I'm going to talk about is with regard to the number 6, which was in September of 2017. It was a model for dyslexia screening. And again, it was about looking at important points to consider when looking at screener choice and looking at using it within a system, specifically universal versus targeted tier 2 screening. And the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen was also then reviewed within context. So at that point, we had a large number of SLPs. So I must have misspoke earlier because I said that SLPs weren't the number one attendees in all of the sessions, which is incorrect. In this last one, SLPs had over half of the participants, with psychologists coming in at just about 20%. Some of the clinical questions, again, we're starting to see these clinical questions coming in again. How do you link dyslexia and speech? How do you differentiate dyslexia from other learning disorders? So that question comes up to us a lot, which is, in a school system, what do we think about specific learning disability for reading versus dyslexia? Well, that question is interesting in that dyslexia has always been part of or could always be classified under special education law, either by a 504 plan or by looking at a weakness and then certifying that weakness as showing it in academic weaknesses or difficulties learning. So having some kind of condition and then demonstrating the impact of that condition. So really looking at the differences between the two. Dyslexia is part of a specific learning disability, or can be described as a learning disability, but not all reading learning disabilities are dyslexia. So that's really the way that we needed to think about that. And these questions really started to come out a little bit more at this point. Again, looking at some of the phonological questions people were asking us about and follow-up assessments and interventions. So beyond screening, how do we intervene, or how do we look a little bit more diagnostically? So beyond the screening, when I look at somebody to say, hey, this person has some characteristics that look as though it might be a reading difficulty, then how do I get into the dyslexia diagnostic assessment? There are no screeners that will tell me a child is dyslexic or is not dyslexic. The screeners are going to show me who is at risk and who is not at risk, or at least that's what they should be doing. Once we get into the diagnostic process, that's when we start to differentiate between dyslexia and not dyslexia. So at that point, it is really important for school districts to make sure you have in place a very structured and streamlined process. And these questions really, you can see them here on the screen. They started to come out, and these comments really started to come out. So again, you can see here, if a student is found at risk, what are the components? What are the components of a comprehensive diagnostic evaluation? What about resources for helping student who has been diagnosed with dyslexia? So again, looking at the later sections, the later questions of that of the process beyond screening into the diagnostic, intervention, and monitoring component. We also did have a lot of organizational workflow questions come out at this point, and also some assessment-specific questions, again with more or less with psychometrics, but looking more about how speech-language, the field of speech and language pathology supports reading, and can they be part of the diagnostic process? Should they then be part of the process in the school systems? Also, with regard to psychometrics, we had some specific questions about psychometrics. How do effect size, with respect to effect sizes, how many more students would be labeled at risk based on the different effect sizes? So really coming out with questions about how screeners will affect how many students are being identified. And then again, looking at assessment-specific tests questions, like how do speech-language pathologists choose specific tests? How culturally sensitive are they? Can they be used to address the bilingual population, and so forth? And you can kind of read them over here. So essentially, what hopefully you saw in this data was a pattern and some patterns. How do you really think about these patterns as they move along in time with regard to how different states and different regions, legislative and regulatory landscape changed at that time? So what we're seeing across professions, what we're seeing in the comments. I mean, we have a huge data set of people's comments and questions, and really this has a lot of implication for our field of professional development across universities, but also in school systems for how they support across professions. So where do folks need to learn? What are some areas that a school system may need to address to make sure that all of the professionals in the interdisciplinary team are addressed appropriately? So before we move on to the more discussion-oriented pieces of this, what I'd like you to do is, with one word or one or two words, what themes did you notice throughout the 6 sessions? What did you see come up that you saw across all 6 sessions going back to August of 2016? And I'll read some of them off when we get to them. Oh, wow, I'm getting a lot coming through, guys. Thank you very much for these comments. Questions, intervention, confusion and uncertainty, political understanding, uncertainty, statistics, phonological awareness, involvement of SLP, scope of practice, beyond screening, confusion, interventions, roles, diagnostics, details, involvement, screening, resources, assessment, phonological awareness. Lots of questions, absolutely. Connection with dyslexia and SLD, testing materials. What now? That's a good one. What now? Even though that's two words, that's what now? That's absolutely true. What do we do next? More information needed. Diagnosing, confusion, practical knowledge. Absolutely. You guys are really picking up on some of these questions, lack of understanding, a diagnostic tree. So it's interesting to see, you guys are picking up on all these different themes that we saw coming from participants. So what does that mean? Where do we go next from here? It's clear that as a group in education or in human services, we need to come up with a process for making sure that the educational landscape is properly educated, that we have consistency across professions and roles. So let's move into, thank you guys all for participating in that poll. Let's move into the SLP roles in dyslexia, and I'm going to pass this back over to Tina, and we're going to start really thinking about what do we do next? How do we better our practice? Tina?
Great, thanks, Adam. So let's get into this. One of the things that we think is important is that whatever we talk about in roles in dyslexia, whether they're SLPs or psychs or reading specialists or teachers, what have you, that we should do things that, of course, we all agree are evidence-based. So one of the reasons that we went through the data set like we did is because we learned from gleaning those comments at the individual level what current practice may look like, which is really the focus of our conversation today. And then, of course, next steps, what we might do to continue to push that forward based on the evidence. So if we look at whether you're an SLP or not, it's important to know the role of SLPs in dyslexia. And so many of you on the call, of course, probably already know this, but this is not new for us as a profession. In 2001, ASHA came out with the roles and responsibilities of SLPs in reading and writing, and it wasn't new then, but it's the first statement publicly and officially that ASHA made about our role in written language, which also includes dyslexia. If you go out to the ASHA's practice portal right now, there's a huge area in written language disorders, of which dyslexia is a part. We have, like many professional organizations do, communities. Here we call them our special interest groups, or SIGs, which have active listservs that are constantly talking about written language, dyslexia in particular, and other related topics. There's a couple of comments in the chat box that I was watching, and I made a note about we really need to have a special whole single hour talking about comorbidities in dyslexia, ADHD, auditory processing, all those kinds of other things that come into the world of dyslexia as well as related disorders, because it's a single student. And of course, they have lots of things going on sometimes. The role of oral language in dyslexia. I don't think I have this in the slides, but if you haven't read the paper by Hugh Katz and colleagues from, I think, 2001 in Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in the Schools, there's a fantastic paper about oral language being a protective factor versus a risk factor in dyslexia in particular. And so that's just one sort of tidbit as we think about the SLP's role in oral language and then, of course, in written language as it relates to dyslexia. So ASHA's got a very large role in this space, in this conversation, and that impacts the SLP as we relate then to other professions. So what we learned from the data as we think about roles and responsibilities, the current state as these 6,000 or 7,000 people have talked to us about is that it's still variable. So SLPs as a profession, I think unlike school psychologists or unlike classroom teachers in their own ways, or even reading specialists, we have this variability from, I'm not really touching that at all. I don't have time. My caseload's too big. I really can't go there. It's not my specialty area. To, I'm kind of getting into it. I'm in there, but I'm not fully in. To SLPs who specialize in dyslexia, have tremendous amount of additional training in dyslexia beyond what we get in our practicum in our university programs. But like many of you said, one of the things that we gleaned from the themes from the webinar data is that in fact there's plenty of confusion and uncertainty, not just in SLPs, but in how to have SLPs on your dyslexia teams in education. So all of that confusion and uncertainty is about the role of oral language, like I mentioned earlier, but also what role should the SLP take in particular in a particular team. So, you know, people have asked us, well, what's the right answer on this, Tina and Adam? Well, I would love it if it was completely black and white, but it's not, because it's so dependent on where your school, where your district is in this overall workflow process. So it may be that an SLP is fully engaged on a dyslexia team. It may be that the SLP consults. It may be that the SLP jumps in with a particular kind of intervention support for students either in an RTI process or from a caseload standpoint in partnership with a reading specialist or an LD teacher or a special ed teacher. I think what's right